Welcome to the temporary John Jay Homestead. Good evening, everybody. Good evening. Hi. I'm Melissa Vale, trustee of the Friends and chair of the Speakers Committee, and we are excited to have so many of you here with us in person, given this very tumultuous moment. We did have a number of people who couldn't come this evening because they were called away to have conferences and talk to clients and do whatever, try to calm people down. So we're just delighted to have so many of you here. Welcome especially to the teachers and students in our audience. And I think we have a member of the Fox Lane History Club here. And yes, there we go. Grant, nice to have you. And we have one of your questions, which we're saving for a good moment later. Everyone, please turn off your phones. We regret that we're not offering a live stream tonight. We learned late yesterday that the Playhouse was not able to fix in time the sound problems that we've been experiencing. So we're sending around refunds and deep apologies to people who had signed up, and we'll be sending tonight's recording to everyone. And the sound quality on those recordings is just fine, we believe. So in-person audience, you have to do double thinking and double duty to represent those who would have been on the live stream. Mm-hmm. We already have some questions for our speaker, but we always want more. And later, shortly, we'll be passing around note cards and pencils where you can write down your questions and bring them up to us. Some thank yous to our Speakers Committee for their indispensable support of these talks, to our outstanding public partner, the New York State Office of Parks, Recreation, and Historic Preservation, for everything. And as always, and most important, our members, who are our most dependable source of support and really our reason for being. Now, here's my question. Quick show of hands. How many of you are already members? Okay, still some more to go, and I'm sure a lot of you will sign up really shortly. Thank you in advance. Please take a look at the Friends website for the exciting finish of this great season. On May 6th, we have Richard Brookhiser with his book, Glorious Lessons, John Trumbull, Painter of the American Revolution. He was a diplomatic colleague of John Jay's, and he thought of himself as a historian, even though his contemporaries thought of him as a painter, and he basically invented the idea of narrative history painting. That'll be a great talk. And then on the 18th of April in 25, we will be celebrating Paul Revere at Rochambeau Farm with a dramatic reading of the poem and family-friendly activities that I'm pretty sure involve lanterns. Then I understand that the Playhouse, by coincidence, I think, is screening Inherit the Wind on April 29th. That's right, isn't it? So keep an eye out for that and come and see it, even though I'm told that our author says she didn't watch the movie until her book was finished. So as you see, these are all ways of telling stories in archives, in paintings, in poems, and tonight in trials and the new media of radio and newsreels. So here's a Zoom feature that we're keeping, the survey. I'm going to ask you a question, and I want a lightning response by show of hands. How many of you went to church regularly as a child? How many? All right, so Emily, what do you think? That's like 90%?
Yes.
Okay. And how many of you go to church regularly now? Slightly fewer. And this is too bad because often our remote audience comes in with different answers in different proportions than the in-person audience does. And that would have been fun to do that comparison. But too bad. Now the last part from me before you get to hear our speaker, those of you who've come to our talks know that we look for a J connection to the topic of the evening. Tonight we have two stories about religion. Jay was an observant, pious Protestant, deeply involved with the Episcopal Church, one of the founders who's sometimes held up as looking for a, quote, Christian nation. After his government career, he was vice president and then president of the American Bible Society. The ABS promoted a mix of views that range from ones that we might recognize as liberal to others not so much. A core belief was that the widespread dissemination of Scripture would help transform the United States into a true Christian republic, but with an insistence that the Bible needed to be unmediated by commentary and notations, and that anyone who wanted a Bible, King James Version, should be able to get one without at the same time having to accept the prayer book of a particular denomination. Then later, in 1834, after Jay had died and no descendants were involved with the ABS refused a contribution from the American Anti-Slavery Society, where many Jays were involved. The purpose of that gift was to subsidize Bible distribution to enslaved Americans, and that was a bridge too far for the American Bible Society. Then I have another story, which is he was also involved in some fairly serious level anti-Catholic proposals. His ancestors were Huguenots, French Protestant refugees whom Louis XIV had given the choice of converting to Catholicism, living in a prison or convent, or leaving the country. About 200,000 left the country, many of them from the French port of La Rochelle, and they then moved to America and founded the Westchester town of New Rochelle, where the football team is still called the Huguenots. So John Jay inherited a healthy commitment to free exercise of religion and also some suspicion of the Catholic Church, to the extent that he proposed a provision in New York State's Constitution that would require a test oath for applicants for citizenship and candidates for state office to renounce foreign ecclesiastical powers, i.e. the Pope. Both of those proposals failed, one because he withdrew it, and the other because it was voted down. His reason was suspicion of the Catholic Church, but also a fear that the Pope could absolve citizens from guilt for violating the oath to support the Constitution, and not just control foreign policy, but give an alternate source of authority for an oath, which was a very serious business at that time. And that's enough about a Jay story. Now our speaker, Brenda Wineapple.
I have no Jay stories.
Yeah, you do. Has won fellowships and awards from the Cullman Center for Scholars and Writers, the Guggenheim Foundation, the American Council of Learned Societies, the National Endowment, and the American Academy of Arts and Letters. She has written books about Andrew Johnson, Emily Dickinson, Gertrude and Leo Stein, Nathaniel Hawthorne, and Walt Whitman, and others. Her articles and essays are everywhere. Welcome, Brenda Wineapple.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for coming on this cold night.
Yeah. Not as cold as we were expecting, I
Yeah.
have to say. I'm going to
We'll
start.
warm it up for you.
Yeah. Well, we better. I'm going to start by asking you to set the stage for Tennessee in 1925. What was it like? Was it the way W.E.B. Du Bois described it, Tennessee is America? Or was it more of an anomaly or a place in transition? What was it like?
Well, Tennessee, when W.E.B. Du Bois made the comment that Tennessee is America, he was referring directly to Dayton, Tennessee, and more specifically, he was referring to the Scopes trial, the Scopes monkey trial, which presumably is why we're here. And I'll explain that in a minute if we don't know what that is. So he wasn't really talking about Tennessee equals America. He was really saying what's going on in Dayton, Tennessee right now, 1925, where you have really a battle between two different factions in the country, one spearheaded by William Jennings Bryan, who had been a 3-time nominee for president on the Democratic ticket and who had been in Woodrow Wilson's Secretary of State, so he was no slouch. And that he was opposed by the American Council, the American Civil Liberties Union, and Clarence Darrow, who was working closely with them. And the fact that these two different points of view that we could talk about, that I'll talk about, were battling it out. And as Brian said, this was a duel to the death for Christianity. And what Darrow and the ACLU said that, wait just a second, this is a violation, that this being an act that was recently passed in the Tennessee legislature, this is a violation of the Constitution, because that particular law was known as the Butler Law, forbid the teaching of evolution in any public school in Tennessee because it seemed to deny the story of Genesis as taught in the Bible. So that's what they were fighting about right in Tennessee, in Dayton, Tennessee at that time. Dayton, Tennessee is in East Tennessee, which itself is an anomaly if you know anything about American history. There's Civil War. We won't have to go there. So actually, Du Bois is being very specific about what was happening at this particular time. This law that was being waged as if it was in a court trial. It was being discussed as if it really was a duel about something so significant in America as to challenge what he believed to be American values.
So give us some thumbnails of those two principles. They were two of the most famous
They were
men
enormously
in
famous.
the country.
Enormously famous.
And who hired Brian? How did Brian get chosen to represent that side of things, and why was he famous?
Well, Brian
and where was he in his career?
Brian had been famous for a very long time. This was 1925. He had literally leaped onto the stage 29 years earlier in 1896. As a young man, he had given a speech at the Democratic National Convention, and I say Democratic because that becomes a sort of interesting phenomenon, but he gave a speech at the Democratic National Convention that so knocked people out. It was so fabulous that the delegates there picked him up and they put him on their shoulders, and they not only marched him around, that they made this young man, it was in his 30s, late 30s basically, one of the youngest people ever to be nominated for the president. So they made him the nominee, which is really unheard of, and he had been unheard of. He was from Nebraska at the time. So he had been in public office for 29 years in one form or another. And even though he was out of office, he'd by this time moved to Florida, where he was selling real estate, making a lot of money. In the 20s in Florida, that was the place to be if you wanted to be an investor. It was probably much safer than anything today is. And so he had moved there. He was doing very well, but he was still a leader in the Democratic Party. And the Democratic wing of the party that he was a leader of was the progressive wing. At the same time, he was a religious fundamentalist. And when I say that, all I mean is this. He believed that you have to read the Bible literally. It's not just a book of spiritual faith. It's not just a book that gives comfort to people. It's not a book of poetry, so those things. But it was written actually by God. God dictated it, and you read it literally, which means Melissa, myself, and all the women in the audience, we're directly descendant from Adam's rib. It's quite literal in that. So since he was a fundamentalist, there was a very increasingly powerful group called the Christian Fundamentals Association, basically. And the head of it thought, they passed this legislation that I just mentioned in Tennessee the ACLU had put an ad in the Tennessee papers saying that they would support anyone who broke the law so that they could have a test case, because they wanted to get this law before the Supreme Court. And since the ACLU is battling this law, I thought, you know, who's the best orator, the biggest leader, the most powerful person to send to Tennessee? William Jennings Bryan. And of course he went. So that's William Jennings Bryan. There's much more to say about him, but nonetheless. On the other side, as I mentioned, is the ACLU. It had only been founded 5 years earlier in 1920. And they had a wonderful group of lawyers, but the defendant, a young man named John Scopes, who was the person who said, I broke the law, I taught biology. You can't teach biology without teaching evolution. So he was, in a sense, the guinea pig. He was the test case for what was about to transpire. He wanted Clarence Darrow. And who was Clarence Darrow? I can't think, maybe you all can think of somebody.
I'm going to interrupt. I think you also say that Darrow volunteered when he learned that Bryan was going to be on the other side.
He did, but it was Scopes that wanted him.
Okay.
In other words, he definitely, Darrow couldn't stand Bryan, and he definitely wanted to be part of this team. But Scopes was the one who really wanted him, because the ACLU didn't want him. He wasn't in. He was going to become a member very shortly of the ACLU, but it was not the guy that the ACLU wanted to send to Tennessee. So Scopes really wanted him. When the ACLU was kind of dithering, Darrow, who said, I'm going to do this for nothing, you don't have to pay me, he was allowed to stay on the defense team. And he was he was very well known. He had also been very well known as a labor lawyer, and before that, after that, as a criminal defense attorney. Most recently, he'd been in Chicago, which was where he was from, and he was defending two young men, Leopold and Loeb. Some of you may have heard of Leopold and Loeb. Their reputation sort of lingers on. They were these two kids, basically, who killed a third person just for the hell of it. And Darrow defended Leopold and Loeb not because he thought they were innocent, which they weren't, they admitted the crime, but because he didn't want them to be executed. He so hated capital punishment. So he was a kind of attorney who really went to bat for what he believed in, no matter who you were. He was called by the journalist Lincoln Steffens the attorney for the damned, because many of the cases he took on, nobody else would take on. So he was also a bit of a lightning rod, because he seemed kind of radical. He had defended radicals. He defended Leopold and Loeb. He was always in headlines, basically. So the fact that he was going to be in Dayton, and that you would have William Jennings Bryan and Clarence Darrow, suddenly journalists couldn't wait to come to Dayton, Tennessee. That's the thumbnail of the story.
Yeah. And so did Scopes have any clue what he was stepping into?
Probably not. It's hard to imagine even now. Imagine here, it's a nice village, what have you, and that suddenly 200, still a lot, 200 or so journalists, people with cameras and newsreels suddenly come to town to cover, an event in a small town, in a small courtroom that really, doesn't have the excitement of these major figures coming. There were all kinds of people. So Scopes, of course, could not have imagined what he was getting into. One of the things interesting about Scopes, he was about 24 years old, I think. He was
also like a football coach.
Yeah, he was a substitute biology teacher. He was teaching biology, and as I said, he said you can't teach biology without teaching evolution. I'm always amused by the fact that he was teaching from a state-authorized textbook, so it's in evolution's in the state-authorized textbook. But, he's there. And when all of these people swoop down into Dayton, Tennessee, as it was at 100 years ago, it's the same as it was then and now. People want to, give him a book deal. People want to put him in a movie. He's a good-looking guy. He's a celebrity. He won't take anything. He won't do the book deal. He doesn't really want the limelight at all. So I'm sure he didn't know what he was getting into, but he never balked. He never sort of retired from it. He never said no. He was there, quiet. His father had come to town. They sat in the courtroom like everyone else. He was a very unassuming, unpretentious young man.
Sounds like he was a perfect test plaintiff, right? He wasn't going to be a lightning rod in his own right.
No, not at all.
Two
Not at all. He was
were.
Perfect in that.
Yeah.
They couldn't have done better. Central Casting couldn't have done better.
Yeah. And so Brian had many very public and very dramatic political campaigns.
Very dramatic.
Where was he in the arc of his career, and where was Darrow in the arc of his career?
Well, Darrow is still a force to conjure with. As I said, in 1924, the year before Scope's trial, he was in Chicago defending Leopold and Loeb. I mean, that was one of the many trials of the century, and it was so horrible, basically, because of these, as I said, because the murder seemed motiveless. There was no reason to do what they did. They just thought that they were geniuses, these kids, and could get away with it. And then after the Scopes trial, he went to Detroit and he defended a black family who were attacked by white supremacists who wanted them to move out of Detroit. They were bringing down the neighborhood. And there was a fracas, and one of the men in the house, the black home, shot one of the white men who were kind of mobbing the house. So of course you would think he's guilty of murder. Darrow went to Detroit and defended him, and he was acquitted. I mean, they were acquitted because what Darrow said to the jury is, put yourself, you're all white men, put yourself in the position of this black family. What do you think would happen? They're defending their home. So again, these were enormous cases, and they were pivotal American cases, really. We don't know about all of them. He was even, FDR in the 30s actually appointed him to do something for one of the commissions. But so Darrow was not by any means fading out. They were both men in their mid to late 60s. Brian, I mean, when you're nominated for president and you don't make it 3 times, it's not exactly a sure thing they're going to nominate you for a 4th time. But if you're William Jennings Bryan, you're not necessarily going to believe that. And even if he wasn't going to get nominated for the presidency it would have been 1928, he was still angling to become a senator from Florida. That's where I said he'd moved. So in a way, he was potentially a has-been, but not in his own mind. He was still a very vital, powerful figure. And again, he had enormous following. I mean, there were people in the Democratic Party who were afraid of him, basically, because he had such a large following.
But even as his focus became more religion-based, he run to be the head of the Presbyterian Church, and he lost that.
He lost it because he was too political. The Presbyterian Church didn't want him because they figured this is going to be another way in which Brian is going to bring politics into religion. They really didn't want that. They wanted somebody who was like moderate. And of course, Brian, being Brian, accused the sort of what he called the Black Caucus for keeping him out. Because by this time, he's currying favor with Southern Democrats in order to become either a senator or he wouldn't have minded being a nominee again. I mean, 4th time could be the charm. You never know, in that sense. But yeah, no, he wanted to be the head of the Presbyterian Congress. They didn't want him. It was ugly and divided for sure, but they didn't want the politics of that. He was too much of a lightning rod. He brought too much attention to himself, basically. And the church was there were factions. There are factions always within a large organization, and of course there were factions in the Presbyterian Church.
So talk about this law, the Butler Law, and where else, what other states were passing laws like this, and was this the only place where people were trying to get this legislation through, or were there other places?
There were other places, but they hadn't been as successful as they were in Tennessee. I mean, there were mandates, I think, in Oregon, that you need to read the Bible in schools. But this particular legislation, which is why the ACLU and Darrow went after it, this particular legislation seemed to many people to be a watershed. And so that's why they wanted to make this one a test case, because there were other possibilities in other legislatures, so it was important to the people who were fighting against it to use this as a kind of a stop, in a sense. If they did something here, that they would stop that kind of legislation from happening. Because as I said to the ACLU and to Darrow too, I mean, what you have here is a violation of the First Amendment, right? You're supposed to keep church and state separate. And what the fundamentalists, and certainly Brian, wanted was not to keep that separate, quite not at all. I mean, in fact, what Brian was on record in going to different legislatures and saying, look, there are atheists teaching kids in college and in high school. They're grooming people. You've got to get the Bible back into the schools. But the real fight for him was what he understood evolution to be, which is also complicated.
Back to Tennessee,
Poor
Tennessee. Well, no, Tennessee
It's an
has a
interesting place.
very interesting
Yeah.
bunch of dynamics.
No, it
And
does.
so, was Dayton an outlier in terms of support within the state for this, or was Dayton right in the heart of this kind of support? What was
Neither. Dayton was just this nice little pretty town, basically. The journalist H.L. Mencken, who was a very kind of acerbic, nasty piece of work, who was a wonderful prose style. Everybody read him in the 20s. And he went to Dayton, and he'd been calling the South the Bible Belt. He had all kinds of nasty things to say about the Southerners and about everybody else. But just leaving it with that for a second. When he went to Dayton, he thought, hey, everybody's nice. They're very hospitable. They're not the yahoos and idiots that I thought they were. Eastern Tennessee, just one more thing about Eastern Tennessee. I mean, like a lot of states, certainly during the Civil War, Tennessee was even more divided. I mean, it really was divided. Eastern Tennessee did not really have slavery. Western Tennessee had much more. It was practically one of these places like Virginia, West Virginia, that actually was completely separate from one. I mean, it was that different. So it's a very, very different kind of domain. And Dayton, in the midst of that, it sort of reflects not just the different contingencies in Tennessee, but also in the country. So that there was, the Methodist Church South and the Methodist Church North, and one is much more fundamentalist and one is much more liberal, which was called modernist. You see what I'm saying in that particular case. So it was not an outlier in any way. It was, interestingly enough, it really, in that sense, going back to Melissa, what you said, it really did reflect America, the best and the worst of America. And what Du Bois meant is that it wasn't so much Tennessee and Dayton that was America, but there's something fundamentally disturbed about America that we need to look at. So he wasn't indicting Tennessee or Dayton, not at all. I mean, nobody really did. I think later people sometimes still say to me, Well, they had the trial in Dayton, Tennessee, because the Chamber of Commerce wanted to make some money. Well, what Chamber of Commerce doesn't want to make money? So they were glad to have the notoriety. They were glad to have the tourists. They were glad to play host. But, you know, it was interesting, the town, you know, when Brian came to town, they gave him a dinner. And then when Darrow came to town, they gave him a dinner. So it wasn't as if they were fighting over, you know, that there was a question of belief. I think one citizen said, when he was asked by a reporter, what did the people of Dayton hope to get out of this? And he said, it's good education. We have the best orators, smartest people in the country coming here. We'll learn something.
Tell us about Darwin. So when was Darwin, yeah, quick, a thumbnail sketch of Darwin. When did that happen, and how recent a development was Origin of Species, and how, or another way is, was this debate opportunistic, or was it a true panic over Darwin? And how did social Darwinism then play into this dynamic?
Darwin published The Origin of Species in 1859. So a lot of the kind of hysteria over Darwin, like Marx and Freud basically, but you know, a lot of the shock of Darwin saying that we all are descended from single-cell animals, is based on single cells, I guess you'd say, was really fought out and discussed amply in the 19th century. I mean, we're talking 75 years, sort of, you know, and so by the turn of the century, there really wasn't discussion about Darwin. And one of the things that I always felt about this trial is that the trial theoretically was about evolution, but nobody understood evolution. Nobody understood Darwin. I don't think anybody read Darwin. Certainly, you know, Brian said he did, but I kind of doubt it. Basically, what they were arguing about was a miscasting of Darwin, which was to say that we're all descended from monkeys. Darwin didn't say we're descended from monkeys. That was a kind of way people had come to understand Darwin, and they had come to understand it in certain terms because of what, as Melissa said, was called social Darwinism, that had nothing really to do with Darwin. It had to do with a man named Herbert Spencer coined the term survival of the fittest, right? And so what he was saying, that what Darwin had talked about in terms of natural selection, right, that certain genetic anomalies or mutations sometimes are such that allow one species advantages over another in terms of survival, which had nothing to do with morals at all. It didn't mean one species is better than another. It just means that they're different. The fact that these were mutations is another story, but in any event. So Herbert Spencer came along and he said, well, it's like survival of the fittest. And at the turn of the century, around this time, this whole idea caught on, particularly, especially, I mean, in a lot of places, but I'm talking about America, because it seemed to justify, particularly to the people like robber barons, that you were rich or you survived or your race was better than others because it deserved to be. So if you have wealth, you are a species who's survived and nobody else is supposed to. It's a dog-eat-dog world, in other words. And that's what Brian, as a progressive, hated. He thought that was absolutely disgusting. That, you know, it's not a dog-eat-dog world, and if you don't have the Bible, and if you don't have the Bible, you don't have a moral center. And if you don't have a moral center, then all you have is people vying for top dog, as it were. And the people who become top dog don't care about anybody else, which is kind of true. It has nothing to do with Darwin. We've gone so far away from Darwin and survival of the species and the voyage of the beagle and all that. Not even relevant anymore in that sense. But that's what happened. And by the 1920s, after a lot of reasons why this came back into play, there was enormous influx of immigrants into the country since the turn of the century, so much so that there's immigration restriction laws passed in 1924 to keep people out. There had been strikes and labor unrest, where a lot of people were fighting one another. There'd been racial unrest. There had been women getting the vote. And then there had been World War I, which was horrible. I mean, I can't even get my head around how horrible that must have been, because the more I look into World War I, the less reason there was for it. And it was an unbelievable bloodbath. It was an unbelievable slaughter. And one of the things that, it brought to the fore were mechanized forms of killing, particularly in terms of, say, aerial bombardments, because now you have airplanes and they can drop bombs, or in terms of poison gas, you hear of trench warfare. It was horrible, absolutely horrible. And Brian thought that this was the end result of the theory of evolution, because it allowed people like the Germans, he thought, to say they were the most fit, they should survive and wipe everybody else out. And because he confused science with technology, bombs, planes, all of this, he thought this has to stop. And this is all because of the theory of evolution. It's like, okay, whatever. If only, in some sense, if only things could be fixed in that way. But that's what he thought. And so there were a lot of things that were at play that made this a contentious issue at that particular time in the culture, because the culture was dealing with so many different things. Veterans coming back from the war, black men and women moving up. I mentioned the Detroit issue, moving up to the north, taking jobs. There was just so many things going on that represented change, and people didn't want that kind of change. So it was a very fractious time. We sometimes think of that time as the Roaring '20s. It wasn't really roaring, and to the extent that it was roaring, it was covering over something.
There was a lot of very violent and terrible stuff happening.
Yeah, really
at the same
violent
time.
and terrible stuff. So.
I'm going to ask anyone who wants a card and a pencil to write down a question, raise your hand, and our lovely assistant Emily will bring you one. And then I'm going to ask you to just tell us a little bit about this trial. There was some sweet maneuvering in this trial to what did the advocates want to either get in or keep out of evidence? What were some of the really technical sweet maneuvering pieces of the trial? Because
well,
it's a
on
good
both
story.
sides, there was a lot of maneuvering on both sides. Welcome to trials, right?
Yeah.
Everybody wants to win. So on one side, the defense brought in a lot of scientists who'd volunteered to come, and they were religious men. They were all men. They were religious men who, in some cases, taught Sunday school, and they were attached often to.
And I'm just going to interrupt. Say, raise your hand if you want a card, and Emily will bring you
they
one.
were attached
Great.
to prestigious institutions where they did a lot of work. They had come to testify and explain what evolution was and how it didn't conflict with the Bible or creation, the story of creation at all. But they were outmaneuvered, or not they, but the defense of Scope's team was outmaneuvered because none of the scientists were allowed to testify, which is really remarkable. So all of the people who in the town who said, we'll get a really good education, weren't allowed to hear and meet the scientists. And they just came and hung around and left. So that was one maneuver on the part of the prosecution. On the part of the defense, what the defense did was a very unusual legal tactic. What they did was they called Brian to the stand. And Darrow said, well, I can call Brian to the stand because he has put himself forward as an authority on the Bible. So I'm just calling him on the stand as an authority of the Bible. Yeah, right? And that was some maneuver. By this time, by the way, I just should add, just so they can see this sort of scene, by this time it was hot, it's July. You want to talk about Tennessee, talk about July in Tennessee. Imagine how hot it is. There's no air conditioning, hundreds of people stuffed into a courtroom. The floor is beginning to give way so that the judge thinks, oh my God, we've got to do something because it's going to collapse. They all go outside, and there were bleachers outside, and there was a platform set up, and that's where, that's why it's cinematic, that's where Darrow interrogates, really, Brian on the stand. So that was a very unusual strategy right there. So they're both strategizing, they're both maneuvering.
And it turned out to be humiliating and traumatic for Brian, and he died of a stroke pretty much as soon as the trial was over. That's the short
the guy
version.
was diabetic. It didn't.
Yeah.
I mean, people want to say, "Oh, Darrow, you killed Brian." He didn't kill. Mencken, who always had these great lines, he said, God shot an arrow and aimed for Brian and aimed for Darrow. God shot an arrow and aimed for Darrow and hit Brian instead. So no, I mean that it was terribly hot. They were both really upset. They're red in the face. It was painful, I think, to watch these two men go at it. Brian wasn't humiliated by Darrow in my mind. Brian humiliated himself.
Mm-hmm. So that's a great lead-in to our first audience question from Grant Klein. And tell me if I'm asking this right. What lesser-known person in the trial or in this environment did you find most, or caused you to see it in a different way or in a new way?
Well, it's an interesting question. One of the things I didn't know about the trial, for example, because Darrow gets all the attention, and why not? He's larger than life. But the other people on the defense team with Darrow were amazing. And what's interesting about the defense team, Darrow was an agnostic. He said he didn't believe in God, but he was open-minded, and if there was found out, if he could learn he was fine with that. People could believe whatever he wanted to believe. So he's the agnostic on the defense team. Then there's this really remarkable lawyer, Arthur Garfield Hayes. I just came across a letter of his that he wrote to, it doesn't matter, but anyway, he wrote to Fiorello LaGuardia in 1935, because he's always fighting for civil rights, and he always says, even when you lose, you win. He's just a remarkable guy, and there's an Arthur Garfield Hayes program for civil rights at NYU. I didn't even know who he was. He was not a showboat. He did a lot of the sort of background work. And then there was this other guy, also very strange person, interesting, practicing Catholic, also Dudley Field Malone, who had also worked with Woodrow Wilson, who was a progressive, who actually left his job in Wilson's administration because he was so horrified when a group of women's activists trying to get the vote picketed the White House, and Wilson had them arrested. And Malone was so angry about this because the women had supported Wilson for president, and Wilson had promised them the vote, and now he wasn't so interested in it. So Malone quit the administration. So I mean, he's a guy with principles. And none of these people are, by the way, without flaw, except maybe haze. So they were fascinating to me. They were absolutely fascinating. I never heard of any of them, basically. So they were very, very interesting. I mean, among others, and just to answer that question. But thank you for your question, whoever you are.
How did Brian reconcile his fundamentalism with his progressivism? And I think one of your really interesting themes is how, beliefs that we see aligned are differently aligned in this period. How did that work in his case in particular?
Well, he was asked that a lot. It's an interesting question. And he said there was no contradiction for him at all, because he was a progressive in terms of man's laws, as he put it, and a fundamentalist in terms of God's laws. I mean, it's this kind of facile answer, but that was his answer. As far as he was concerned, he knew what was right, and so he could legislate for the right. So as a result, for example, one example of this, even though it's a complicated issue, is that he was very much for prohibition, because he really felt that you could legislate morality, and by keeping drink, by prohibiting drink and alcohol, people drinking, that you were saving families, and in particular women from abusive husbands. So he really felt he was always doing good in that sense, but he was involved in, what he considered to be legal issues determined by man, but when it came to laws of God, there's no debating about it.
Another Tennessee question. Is there a connection between this trial and Tennessee's role in the passage of the 19th Amendment, where they were the final vote for ratification?
I don't think so. I mean, the answer is I don't know. I really don't know. I have no idea. It seems to paint Tennessee in a bad light, and I'm really loath to do that. I really am. I just got to.
I don't know. I think it's an interesting light.
Well, I don't know. I mean,
Okay.
I don't know the answer.
All right. Talk about Inherit the Wind. You didn't watch, and I haven't seen the movie. I'm going to come see it.
Oh, you'll have such a good
on the 29th. I think you can get it. I think you can stream it now.
Oh, I'm sure you can stream it.
Yeah.
I think I did stream it, actually, now that I think about it. I didn't, I don't see things like that or do things like that. I didn't want it in my head. I didn't want to be talking about it to myself. I didn't want the images from it. In many ways, I was glad, because Spencer Tracy is so amazing as Clarence Darrow. You just want to follow him everywhere, and I'm ready to see anything Spencer Tracy ever did. But as a movie, it's so dated. I think the play was in the late 50s, 57, and the movie was about 1960. It's so dated. And first of all, it's Hollywood, right? So you have to have a love story. So John Scopes has to be in love. It's like Romeo and Juliet. He's in love with the daughter of the fundamentalist preacher, who's, this scary guy, that takes over the whole screen and sort of yells as if he's a reincarnated Jonathan Edwards. And then you have H.L. Mencken, and I gave you some of Mencken's lines, and if you know anything about Mencken, as I said, he's very acerbic, he's nasty, he's an unusual and brilliant guy in many ways, and he's played by Gene Kelly. I mean, it just made no sense at all. And then, if that's not enough, you have this group of women in town, like a mob. They're a mob. They have to be all women. And they look like they just leaped out of, Salem in the Salem witch trials, because they really want to string up John Scopes. Have a good time. I mean, as I said, Spencer Tracy is worth the price of admission. Frederick March plays Brian. To my mind, he's a good theater person. He overacts in this. He's, but his wife, I forget her name, in his real life wife, Frederick March's, plays Brian's wife, and she's actually very good. So, it's a period piece. What's interesting to me about that movie is not the movie, which I thought was really bad, but was the fact that so many people of a certain age, maybe here, I don't know, so many people of a certain age saw the movie and became, when they were kids, and they became lawyers because of it. I mean, that's a powerful thing. so it really meant a lot in its own time because Darrow becomes a hero to so many people.
So this trial has been covered before in lots of ways and places, and you certainly had your beliefs about it before you started this book. What surprised you in your research, and what do you think it leaves us with? Here's another question.
Okay,
I'm going to ask it a different
okay.
way, which is, what's the legacy of this trial? Does it have an enduring legacy, or was it a sideshow and a place for glory hounds?
Mm-hmm. I came to the trial with no beliefs in it at all. I had no beliefs. I don't come to anything with beliefs. I come to things with questions. And my question was, what's going on here? Why was it such a publicity event? And I had no idea. The book I wrote before this was about the impeachment trial, another trial of Andrew Johnson, the first president ever to be impeached. When I started that, I had no idea why. I thought, why don't I know about it? The same kind of thing motivated this. So I didn't really have an idea, but I had heard that is the second or part of the question was that it was a kind of publicity stunt. And then I thought, I want to look into it because it's hard for me to believe that it was just a publicity stunt. Maybe it was, but I'd like to see if there's something more. By the same token, I wanted to see if the impeachment trial of Johnson was as trivial and forgettable as I'd also been told. So it was like, it's like the princess and the pea. Something bothers me, and it didn't set right. So when I started to look into it to answer the question about what surprised me, the whole thing surprised me. You'd also mentioned there were other books on it. The last major book was 25 years ago, and it's a very good book, and it understands the trial in terms of sort of the religious controversies that are going on, which is perfectly reasonable. But I wanted to look at, why all of America became involved in it and what its relationship to the country was. What does it mean to have it called the trial of the century? So the whole thing.
In a century where there are lots of trials.
In a century where there are a lot of trials. Leopold and Loeb was a trial of the century, so certainly. And then later on, not that much later on, 2 years later, Sacco and Vanzetti will, starting in 1920 all the way to 27, is a trial of the century. So, the 20s had a lot of trials right there. So what's going on? And it's easy to know what's going on with Sacco and Vanzetti, it seems to me. But what was going on in the Scopes trial? It can't be just a publicity stunt, like, I don't know, yes, we have no bananas or we're flagpole sitting. It probably has something else. And so I wanted to see the sort of the cultural context of it.
So what's the legacy of it then?
The legacy is, like all situations, it seems to me, like all events, historical events, there is a kind of continuity, it seems to me, in this country, in any country, and it seems that if one becomes more informed about the various woven together strands that create certain events or points of view or prejudices, then one can become more vigilant in dealing with them, whether in dealing with them is combating them or resisting them or whatever it happens to be. And so to me that is the legacy, because it doesn't seem that far away and that long ago. One of the elements of the trial was to make the country into a Christian theocracy. That to me is a very real and present situation. Another aspect of the trial is when Darrow said, if you start banning Bibles in schools, pretty soon you're going to start banning books in schools, and you're going to start banning people from talking. and he went on, and he said he was there to make that phenomenon known and to resist it. And that's another aspect of something I think is very important, is that there are people of courage who stand up against the prevailing winds. So I think that's important. That's, to me, a series of legacies.
That's a good one. This is one of my favorite questions for all of my speakers, is who did you discover who deserves a biography or a treatment, who hasn't really had one or had one recently enough? I want to read more about H.L. Mencken, I gotta say.
Well, there
He
are a
was
lot of
pretty
books
great.
on H.L. Mencken.
Well, I just haven't read them yet. then I
You
have
know,
to.
the thing about H.L. Mencken that I would say, read H.L. Mencken. I mean, Mencken is, you know, he is such a phenomenal prose stylist, and he covers so many things so well that it's just a pleasure to read him. He writes about the American language. He writes about trials. You know, he writes about the Anti-Saloon League. He covered presidential nominating conventions. He was an unusual, he was just an unusual person. So there are books about him, but nothing is quite like him at all.
Like him, in
yeah.
his own words.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Emily, any questions from you? Any that have come into you? No, I got them all. Okay, then we have to stop. Thank you, Brenda,
Thank
for
you.
having taken us through a culture war battle, but one where we know how it comes out.
Well,
And
they lost. They lost. You know they lost, right?
oh, the trial.
Yeah.
Yes,
They lost. You know they lost. But you know what Arthur Garfield Hayes said? Even when you lose, you win.
Mm-hmm.
But they did
so,
lose.
everyone, Brenda is going to be signing books upstairs. If you want to join the Scholars Committee and help us plan next season, you're welcome. And thank you very much for joining us tonight. Thank you.